is school choice? It's a term whose strict definition varies on every level of government, but essentially, school choice refers to a government program that uses public taxpayer dollars to fund individual students' education at a school other than the public schools that each student is assigned to by district. Exactly how those funds are distributed and how they can be used is usually left up to state or town governments to decide. But a year ago, on June 21st, the Supreme Court of the United States decided a case in Maine that would change some of the control states have over these types of programs. So in Vermont, a state that prizes making government decisions at as local a level as possible, the ruling has catalyzed lawmakers and laypeople alike to re-examine the state school choice program and ask, is it worth it? I'm your host, Lorian Strange, and welcome to Strange Education. Episode 1. Choice? Maine and Vermont have very similar school choice systems. Both are built around the idea that some small rural towns don't have the resources to run their own schools. So because under law, all school-age children in the United States have the right to a free public education, the states are still obliged to provide these students with one. So as a solution, they outsource each student's education by providing them with vouchers, which can be used at any school, public or private, in or out of state, or even out of the country, that has been approved by the relevant state or respected accreditation body, such as the New England Association of Schools and Colleges. Now, this is where things get a little tricky. Vermont and Maine had both specified that religious private schools could not be granted approval by the state, Maine since 1981 and Vermont since 1999. Why? Well, since the vouchers are funded by state taxpayer dollars, the idea was that allowing that money to go to a religious school where it would support religious indoctrination and faith-influenced teaching was in violation of the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution, the one that goes like this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. You'll generally hear this kind of idea mentioned as a separation of church and state, which means that the U.S. government isn't allowed to directly fund religious institutions. In the past, this has been taken as meaning that, for example, if your community is building a synagogue, church, mosque, or other house of worship, the government isn't allowed to give them money to help them build or operate it. But that kind of interpretation has been changing over the past few years with recent Supreme Court cases, such as Carson v. Macon. The issue in this particular case was that several Maine families wanted to send their children to religious private schools, but couldn't afford to pay the tuition out of pocket. Though the families lived in towns that did not operate schools at the grade levels of their children, and so were eligible for Maine's tuition assistance program, they weren't going to be able to use state vouchers because the program excluded religious schools. So they took the Maine Department of Education to court to attest that their constitutional rights had been violated. It's funny how a simple sentence can be so polarizing and have phrases that can be interpreted as having contradictory meanings. What I mean is, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause come one right after another in the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In the eyes of lawyers, that's two separate statements, yet it's this one sentence that has had so much potency in both Carson v. Macon and the many debates in its wake, and its interpretation that gave so much power to the people who used it. The court decided 6-3 in favor of the petitioners, the Carsons and the other Maine families. Incidentally, the decision was made along party lines. Justices who had voted in the majority have been nominated by Republican presidents, and justices voting the opposite have been nominated by Democrats. This sort of split is fairly common, though not universal, in school choice debates. Support of increasing the access and extent of school choice programs tends to be a Republican view, and rallying for the improvement of public schools instead is seen more as a Democrat one. And this is especially pertinent in debates about religious schools. So then, it's not surprising that two bills authored in the Congress of Vermont this past legislative session in response to the ruling that sought to avoid funding religious schools by avoiding funding private schools at all were sponsored by Democrats, progressives, progressive Democrats, independents, and even a libertarian, but not any Republicans. But before we dive into that, we need to understand a little more about Vermont's initial response to Carson v. Macon and the factors that led up to the legislative reactions. If you want to understand why Carson v. Macon has caused such a big stir in Vermont, you have to know a bit more about the history of the state's school choice program. The program started in 1869 as a way for children living in rural towns without schools to be able to attend vocational high schools or classical education-oriented academies. And throughout the 154 years since then, Vermont has been reckoning with the question of the constitutionality of funding religious schools with school choice vouchers. Though initially there was no legal language against using voucher money at religious schools, the 1961 Vermont Supreme Court case, Swart v. South Burlington Town School District, determined that this violated the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and a later court case ruled that it also went against the Compelled Support Clause of the Constitution of Vermont, which says that Vermonters cannot be forced to provide means of support to any religion against their will. So Vermont's school choice system has had that secular requirement since 1999. But that's not been the only concern over where these vouchers get to go.
I don't have it up in front of me. My understanding is that there have been sort of attempts in the past and sort of discussion in the past about kind of, even like prior to Carson v. Macon, I guess cracking down on, where the public money goes.
That's Peter Dioria, the education correspondent for VT Digger. I spoke with him about some of the effects that Carson v. Macon has had on the state of Vermont and the situation Vermont's school choice system was in before that Supreme Court ruling.
I know that there was legislative language in some bill that would have restricted the geographic flow of this money, and I think it would have, I'm forgetting exactly, I think there was a proposal to just have it be neighboring states and Quebec, so like no more going to California or Oregon or Colorado or whatever, and that didn't go anywhere.
That bill may not have passed, but the sentiments surrounding it didn't disappear from the legislature.
I think there's this sort of long-standing debate about whether or not there needs to be more control over the public money and whether or not we're spending too much public money in private schools. By definition, if you live in a choice town, there isn't going to be the school within your community to support you. So I do think there's a concern that we're sending taxpayer dollars like out of state, for example, or out of country. And I think that is a concern that we're sort of taking that public Vermont money out of Vermont. I do think that the school choice system, and like maybe we in the local media sphere are somewhat guilty of this as well, but a lot of like time and airtime and ink and attention is spent on that system. A system that relatively involves a pretty small amount of students. And I wonder, I guess there's like a discussion to be had on, how much energy this is taking up.
And that already small student population has only been getting smaller. Vermont is an aging state. Walking around one of its bigger cities, such as Burlington, it can be difficult to get a good sense of that. The population appears young enough from there, but when you get out of the college towns and spend some time in the more rural parts of the state, you start to see it.
So as people age and you see things around you changing, you feel like you're losing a grip on things.
That's Margot Caulfield, a longtime community member of my hometown of Cavendish and writer of Cavendish Connects, a weekly newsletter detailing the news and other happenings around town. She's also the president of our local historical society.
We don't like change, even though it's the one constant in our life. Change is scary, so there's that. But the change is happening. I guess the best way to put this is that the population nationwide has really been on decline since the 1970s, and in 2008 with the recession, it went into warp speed, and so now we're in a place where the birth rate is such that we're not even replacing ourselves. That's a very unusual set of circumstances, so it's a reason that we don't have more students here and more this and more that. It's just plain and simply that the birth rate is just very low. And that's a very scary, uncontrollable variable, because unless you want to go out and think you can populate the world, it's not something you can do much about.
And this is especially true in Vermont. According to the Census Bureau, the state's median age is about 43 years, and 1 in every 5 Vermonters is at age 65 or older. And with the lowest birth rate in the United States at about 8.2 births per 1,000 people, Vermont communities such as Cavendish are starting to feel the effects of that more keenly.
I look at a school like Cavendish Town Elementary School in 1993. They had 130 kids there. That was the first year. So all the classrooms were designed for 20 students. So the school is designed for 140 students. That year they had 104 students in 2004. And the philosophy was, if you build it, they'll come. That didn't happen. And today there's about 72 kids in the school that was designed for 140. So you have half of the school, half of the occupancy isn't there. But yet you have the same number of teachers, and you actually have more paras, more this and more that. And people really start noticing that. And in the fall, that number is going to be below 70. So how much lower is it going to go?
When the Carson v. Macon ruling was announced on June 21, 2022, it presented the Vermont legislature with a unique problem. Not only did many of the legislators see Carson v. Macon as a gross misinterpretation of the U.S. Constitution's religion clauses, funding religious schools with public money is also in violation of the Constitution of Vermont. In Chapter 1, Article 3, there's a clause that reads that no person ought to, or of right can be compelled to, attend any religious worship, or erect or support any place of worship, or maintain any minister contrary to the dictates of the conscience. This is known as the Compelled Support Clause, and essentially means that Vermonters cannot be obliged to support any religion against their wills, whether that support be through labor, worship, or money. For some legislators, this conflict with the two constitutions is not only an issue to be addressed, but an opportunity. That's why, in the 2023 legislative session, Congress introduced 2 controversial bills, ostensibly in response to Carson v. Macon. They didn't pass this year, but they have had a huge influence on the conversations about school choice and education in Vermont. These bills were Senate Bill S66 and its companion bill in the House of Representatives, H.258. Because Carson v. Macon dictates that school choice programs that fund private schools have to include religious schools, S66 proposed solving the constitutional conflicts by limiting public funding of private schools to just 2 specific categories of schools: therapeutic schools and the 4 historic academies. For the purposes of this bill, a therapeutic school is a school that provides an individualized learning plan, or IEP, for every one of its students. This category was designed so that schools that are specifically for special needs education can still receive state funding. Then there's the historic academies. Most Vermont students using school choice vouchers go to one of 4 schools: Thetford Academy, Burr and Burden Academy, St. Johnsbury Academy, and the Linden Institute. All founded before the introduction of Vermont's original school choice program in 1869, they are Vermont's oldest private schools that operate secularly. Many of the families whose students attend these schools would have been virtually unaffected by the bill. Ostensibly, this solution would be an effective way to address the constitutional conflicts created by Carson v. Macon, while still allowing school choice in the spirit of the program as it had been previously implemented in Vermont. But if there's anything that the bill's supporters and critics can agree on, it's that there's more to the story. Because S66 wasn't just pushing for a quick compromise, it was pushing for long-term conversation about school choice in Vermont. I spoke to the lead sponsor of S66 over the phone and had the chance to ask her what she thought about school choice. Her name is Senator Ruth Hardy, and she's a Democrat representing Addison County.
Sort of self-determination and the ability to make your own, choices, whether it's about your body. I know I'm a strong, what's traditionally been called pro-choice, for reproductive rights and reproductive justice. However, I think with school choice, it's kind of gotten a little bit twisted, and it often, the ability to choose your school, just somewhat like with reproductive choice, is varies depending on where you live and what your socioeconomic background is. So I think it sort of can be very problematic and classist. And I also think that sometimes, depending on how it's implemented, it undermines public education and undermines the ability of kids who are in our public schools to get a good education. And I'm a very strong supporter of public schools and public education.
I also asked her if she had sponsored S66 as a response to Carson v. Macon, or if she saw the bill more as addressing some pre-existing issues that she had with Vermont's independent school system as it stands.
I kind of think it's both. The timing of it certainly was in response to Carson v. Macon, because basically we're at this point where our state has to do something, because we have basically a private school voucher program that is unlike almost any other state. And it's really problematic with our own Vermont Constitution and the compelled support clause. And it's problematic with the U.S. Constitution and the separation of church and state. So, and Carson v. Macon basically said that more or less. And so the timing of it is in response to Carson v. Macon. But I have, I've served on a public school board for a number of years before I was a state senator, and was the chair of our local elementary school board. And as I said, I'm a strong supporter of public schools and public education. And so I think it is healthy for us to open up this conversation.
I also had the opportunity to speak to another sponsor of S66. Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale, a Democrat from Chittenden County, invited me up to the State House after this year's veto session had concluded for our conversation. And she agreed that S66 was more about opening conversations than getting immediate results.
I did not expect for it to pass in the exact form that it was introduced. That bill was probably the absolute cleanest way that you could have the conversation, because what the Supreme Court decision did was make states have to draw a really bright line. You know, we looked at what Maine did, and Maine essentially tried to say, well, you know, we just don't like schools that have religious values, but some schools are okay because they don't quite discriminate, and some schools aren't okay. And if you're using a lot of subjectivity in the discussion, then the Supreme Court is not really going to rule in your favor, or the law of the land now will not be on your side. So we knew that we had to draw some kind of bright line, and that bright line was a way to start the conversation, where I think a vast majority of Vermonters would understand as a starting place, because the 4 academies have been around for so long and are really embedded in our public school system. But this conversation did start before the Supreme Court decision. This conversation has been going on a long time, because the more private schools that open up in Vermont, or the more people want to send those dollars out of New England, let's say, because now we have a compact to focus it on New England, the more we have to question what our education policy is and what we mean by public education. And if those institutions have to follow the same rules that our public institutions do. So generally, I believe that if you have public dollars, you should, at the bare minimum, be meeting public standards for what open, accessible, and equal education looks like. And that's where we started to need to address this more urgently, with the Supreme Court decision that fundamentally allows for exclusion of certain ideas or certain values or even certain identities.
Senator Hardy also told me that she was concerned about school choice enabling private institutions to receive public dollars.
So I think it's really important for us to have the conversation about, do we as Vermonters and as the state of Vermont want to continue to send fairly considerable sums of money to private schools that don't have to abide by the same rules and laws as our public schools? And what does that mean for our Constitution? And what does that mean for our public school system in Vermont, which we pride very heavily in our small state?
But for many individuals, independent schools are prized just as highly. Families enjoy the flexibility that these schools can offer, as well as sustaining an environment that may be more appropriate for a student academically and socially. I'm going to read you some excerpts from a letter to the legislature regarding a 2016 bill that was very similar in nature to S66, written by then-sophomore Nava Crisp. She attended the Long Trail School in Dorset, a college prep school that offers the state's only international baccalaureate program, an education method that is recognized all over the world as being academically comprehensive, rigorous, and challenging. According to their website, 60% of Long Trail's student body uses some form of financial aid, including school choice vouchers, to cover the $22,000 tuition. Though the bill the student was writing about has been dead for over 7 years, her comments reflect the sentiments of many people I've spoken to off the record about S66 and independent schools. She wrote, "Many small and rural towns in Vermont simply can't afford to financially support a high-quality education for their youth. School choice has enabled me to receive a better education without the economic burden of paying for full tuition. Instead of attending the public school closest to my home in Danby, I've been privileged to attend Long Trail instead. Not only has Long Trail provided me with an excellent education, but it has nurtured me, inspired me, and developed me both as a student and a person, and allowed me to thrive in an environment that suits me best, one that I would not have had if I was in a much larger public school." Without school choice, the majority of students and their families at Long Trail would be afflicted by choosing whether to commit to an annual substantial cost so that they are able to attend, or to go instead to whichever public academic institution is available, regardless if it's considered to provide a good education, resources, and social atmosphere. Without school choice, the already minuscule younger population will only dramatically decline. Why would people with a family find moving to Vermont as appealing if there would be a dramatic decrease in good school options that aren't too costly? Why would people already living in Vermont stay if their children wouldn't have as many options as they would in other states? A friend of mine's family moved from California to take advantage of Vermont school choice and to attend Long Trail. So many of us rely on school choice to be able to be at the school we want to be at, and it wouldn't be fair to take that liberty away from us. Either my school would need to shut down as a result of a significant loss to its already small student body, and because it would be unable to provide enough scholarships for the amount of students that would be seeking them if school choice was lost, or, if school choice is continued, it can maintain its reputation for being an amazing school that its students love and flourish in. It's hard enough living in a state where there aren't a lot of kids or opportunities for kids to take hold of. Don't get me wrong, I love Vermont, and personally think that its natural beauty and warm community are sufficient reasons to live here. But, despite this, one of the things I love most about it is that it has given me the chance to go to Long Trail with school choice. After years of attending a variety of schools, ranging from cyber school to public school, in an attempt to find one I truly liked, I found it. I've been academically challenged, pushed to succeed, and fortunate to participate in the International Baccalaureate Diploma Program at the only school in Vermont that offers it. I had the chance to ask Senator Hardy, the lead sponsor of S66, what she thought about the criticisms that the bill would harm the independent schools such as Long Trail that provide adequate academic challenge for students where public schools do not.
Are you a student at the Long Trail School?
I am not. I am a homeschooler.
Okay. I think that, our quote unquote independent schools, which are usually called private schools in most other contexts in most other states, by the very nature of being private, they are sort of, it's their, they have to take the initiative to become self-sustaining and self-supporting. Public funding and public dollars are they're not guaranteed, and they shouldn't be guaranteed for private schools. And so if private schools are banking their sustainability on public dollars, then I think it's really important that they understand and create a different sustainability plan for themselves. Public funds should be for public institutions and public purposes, and the private schools aren't always operating for public purposes. In fact, by very nature, they're operating for private purposes. So I think that their they need to create their own sustainability plan to be able to stay viable without public dollars.
What I'm starting to see about Vermont's response to Carson v. Macon is that it was never actually about funding religious ideas. Rather, it's about funding ideas in general. As with the rest of our country, Vermont's been embroiled in a sort of culture war. In our case, it's about tradition versus innovation, public versus private, and determining the balance between choice and the greater good. These debates all existed here long before Carson v. Macon. It's just that this court case has brought a new awareness and a new incentive to the conversation, spurring legislators to reconsider all facets of our school choice and education systems, and forcing our aging small towns to re-examine their relationships to their schools. Though Essex 6 and its companion bill didn't pass, and no conclusive action was taken to resolve the constitutional conflict, this conversation isn't over. The legislator will still be looking for ways to address both Carson v. Macon and the question of independent schools. As Senator Rom Hinsdale put it, there are going to be winners and losers no matter what the legislator eventually decides. The question now is, will Vermont communities count themselves among the winners? Next time on Strange Education, we'll be taking a closer look at the relationship between rural Vermont communities and local schools, and what happens when small towns lose those schools. Strange Education is written, edited, and produced by me, Lorian Strange, at Okemo Valley TV in Ludlow, Vermont. Our music was written by my younger brother, Luke Strange. Special thanks to Patrick Cody and Rebecca Fontaine for letting me borrow and use their equipment to make this podcast, and to Senator Rom Hinsdale for giving me so much of her time and inviting me up to the State House. I also wouldn't have had the opportunity to start this podcast without the support of my U.S. government teacher, Dr. Joseph Malarek, and my family. And thanks to everyone else who has contributed to my podcast in some way. Often, I think you helped more than you could know. We'll be back with episode 2 in August. Thanks so much for listening.